So I'm sitting here in my basement just thinking about Bloodborne, which is a game that I have been playing with extreme rigor for the past year. At this point, I'm pretty sure that I'm well over 200 hours into it. I've tested a lot of different builds and yada yada. I would confidently say at this point that it is my favorite game of all time, but that doesn't mean I would give it a 10 out of 10. I think the game does have a couple of critical flaws, but I think that overall the experience is so good that I would give it a super high score anyway. Though I disagree with some other people about where those flaws are. I know some people, for example, think that blood vials are a huge step back from Estus, that, the fact that you have to farm blood vials is a big problem, and it really sucks. Why did they do this? But I think what those people are not understanding is that you're not supposed to farm blood vials. The whole point of Bloodborne is that you yourself are supposed to be super aggressive. You are a blood-crazed, blood-drunk hunter. You're half a beast yourself, and every mechanic in the game is encouraging you to be all risk and reward, super aggressive, not backing down, etc. And the idea is, if you're out of blood vials, instead of trying to retreat back to the lamp, I keep saying lamp, but lantern, lamp, whatever. Instead of trying to retreat back to the lantern and play it safe, it's encouraging you to be more aggressive and to try to get more blood vials from your enemies as you go. Because unlike Estus, where you had a finite number of charges and then you had to scurry back to the bonfire and play it safe, there was always this very conservative, passive philosophy to Dark Souls where you had to be very careful. Bloodborne encourages you to throw caution to the wind and go rush into danger in the hopes of scoring more blood vials from your opponents, and which is how you had to farm them anyway. Even if you ran back to Central Yharnam and did the circuit with the trolls and all that other shit, you still have to fight to earn your blood vials. It's not like Dark Souls where you go fucking chill out in your little safety corner and you get your Estus back. So I don't think that blood vials are a step back at all. I think people just misunderstand the design choice there because they're nervous, especially on your first playthrough. You're kind of scared, and the idea of being super aggressive and pressing forward even if you're out of blood vials is pretty scary to new players, especially if you're running around holding a ton of blood echoes. But that's the whole point. That's also the joke with the shields, where if you look at the description of the wooden shield, it makes fun of it and says, shields are all well and good as long as they don't engender passivity. Same thing with the healing mechanics. Estus is all well and good as long as it doesn't engender passivity, which it absolutely did, given that 90% of people who beat Dark Souls do so by holding the shield button and circle strafing their opponent until they get a backstab. But one thing that I really want to talk about with Bloodborne that hits home, that I don't see a lot of people talking about, is the music. Okay, so I will confess right now that I have yet to play Dark Souls 2 and 3. I've played Dark Souls 1 and I've played Bloodborne. This is actually because many years ago I tried Dark Souls, didn't like it, really just didn't understand the whole philosophy of how to play that game. I got stuck on Taurus Demon and just said, fuck it, I'm tired of running over to this boss from the bonfire every time. I'm going to go play something else. And when I first picked up Bloodborne, I was late to the party anyway. I picked up Bloodborne in 2017 for the first time. I'd only bought my PS4 that summer to... Really, honestly, I bought my PS4 for the sake of Hatsune Miku Project Diva Future Tone. And I was like, okay, well, people keep telling me that Bloodborne is this cool, spooky, Lovecraft-influenced blah, blah, blah game, so I'll pick it up. And, I couldn't get past Father Gascoigne. And I got so frustrated, I said, fuck it, and I quit. But time went by, and people were telling me, you just gotta have some patience with it. Understand the philosophy that, you need to learn to parry, and this and that. And so I said, okay, I'll give it a shot. And as soon as I got good and beat Father Gascoigne, the whole game opened up to me. And that was how I started playing Bloodborne. And it clicked into me, and I went back and played Dark Souls and enjoyed that a lot. But to rope it back in, I have had a lot of interesting time to think about the music in the two games and how they're different. For those who don't know, the Dark Souls OST is composed by Motoi Sakuraba, who is a pretty controversial figure, I think, from what I've gathered in the soundtrack of video games appreciation community. Some people really like Sakuraba's work and some do not. Whereas Bloodborne is a much more collaborative soundtrack. I think there are no less than 4 composers on it. There's Yuka Kitamura, there's Ryan Amon, there's 2 others whose names I'm not remembering off the top of my head. I think Sakuraba may have even contributed some of it, but I'm not sure. But anyway, Yuka Kitamura's tracks are the ones that stand out the most to me. But I think that having multiple composers on Bloodborne did it a great service, because with the Dark Souls soundtrack, I honestly think a lot of it is unfortunately brought down by being extremely repetitive. Sakuraba kind of has this compositional technique, or at least he did in that game, where he sits down in front of his keyboard, he opens up Omnisphere or whatever program he's using, and he looks for all of the choral choir samples that go ooh, ah, oh, and then he just starts fucking with those, and then he throws on some dramatic instrumentals, and that's the track. That's the track for at least 3/4 of Dark Souls. I actually had kind of a fun time just skipping around the OST and seeing how many tracks don't start with an oh sound, and it is like 3 out of 25. It's ridiculous. Just try it. If you have the soundtrack in your media library, just go through it and see how many tracks don't start with the choral oh noise. It's Firelink Shrine, Soul of Cinder, and 1 or 2 other ones, like Pinwheel. And for the record, those are the ones that stand out the most. If you ask people which songs from Dark Souls 1 they remember, it's probably going to be Firelink Shrine, Soul of Cinder, maybe Pinwheel if they're into spooky music, and Night Artorias. And that's probably it. Maybe somebody will remember Calamite, but they won't be able to hum it to you. They'll just remember that it was cool. Meanwhile, Bloodborne is way more varied. There's way more going on. Even in the very beginning, right? You get to Cleric Beast. Cleric Beast is more of that traditional church choir, dun 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 dun, very sonorous. And you might think it's going to be like Dark Souls in that way. But then the next boss you fight is Father Gascoigne, who has none of that. That climax, that chorus, is entirely driven by string instruments. It's that cello line. Totally different. And there's so much variety in the way that the soundtrack is presented throughout the game. And despite having 4 or more composers on the soundtrack, it retains a really cool, unified sort of thematic identity, I guess I would say. Not in a leitmotif sense. I know that the music theory people are crawling out of the woodworks to be like, oh, what theme are you talking about? Not a literal theme. But it all fits the aesthetic of the game. No soundtrack piece in Bloodborne feels out of place. And I'm thinking of some of the really cool ones. For example, one of my favorites is the Hail to the Nightmare, which is a really, really cool, like, dark, quiet call and response piece where a deep male voice calls and a high-pitched female choir responds, and it just goes back and forth like this for a while. And it sets the mood so well for the area it's in, because the area you're in is like kind of spooky. You know that this organization has done bad things here, and it's like very mysterious and ritualistic, and it's just so good at setting that mood. And then on the other side of the coin, there's a track called Soothing Hymn, which is anything but. It's this incredibly scary soundtrack. It's just like this really high-pitched, shrill noise that waxes and wanes, and some background ambiance, and that's it. But the area you're listening to that in is like an actual horror area. Like, it's very, very scary. It's very dark. Monsters jump out of you from nowhere, and like you're very tense as you go through it, and it just works. It works incredibly well. And then you got pieces with a more traditional structure. One of the pieces in the DLC, which at this point is probably my favorite piece of video game music of all time, hands down, maybe even my favorite piece of music, period, is a song called Lady Maria of the Astral Clock Tower. That piece is absolutely fucking divine. The structure is like a roller coaster. It has this long intro coupled with a super explosive intro verse, followed by a still dramatic and very aggressively forward-moving bridge that leads into another chorus, and then a very cool slow-down bridge that leads into this extremely explosive final chorus that lasts for like a minute. It is incredibly cool. It combines the best of the ambient noises. You've got this really awesome clock tower noise that happens in the background because she's Lady Maria of the Astral Clock Tower. You've got the choral thing going on, but like it just works really well. It doesn't feel cliched at all. It's an incredible piece of music. The DLC for Bloodborne is like Dark Souls 1 DLC tier, and it's very good. And it only adds 5 new pieces of music to the game, but every single one of them is very memorable and very good. I mean, I could probably sit here and gush about Bloodborne's music all night, because there's something to the tune of 25 tracks plus 5 more from the DLC, and every single one of them is so idealistically distinct and musically unique that they're worth individually picking apart. Whereas in my opinion, the Dark Souls soundtrack is way less so. It just feels like, 15 variations on the exact same kind of song with a few interesting tracks thrown in here and there. But that's the music of Bloodborne. The aesthetic of Bloodborne is ridiculously good. There are moments where, like, you could just take a screenshot of the Bloodborne in-game and set that as a wallpaper and it would be gorgeous. I mean, the fact that all the cutscenes in the game are fully realized with nothing more than in-game graphics, like, at first that blew my mind. I actually didn't even realize that I was looking at in-game graphics. I thought it was rendered CG. And then the camera would pull back and I would just take control of the character and say to myself, holy shit, like, that wasn't pre-rendered, it was just the game. And it's that pretty at every moment, at every turn. There's no bad looking part of this game. The areas all feel distinct. It's drenched in this really cool gothic Victorian horror vibe, and it looks great. The sky is just incredible looking. There's only a few areas where I noticed like very minor glitches with that. Ironically, the only Old Yarnum is the only place I've ever noticed any major problems. It's kind of funny. If you're in Old Yarnum, when you exit the doors and you look up, you'll see a statue floating in the air that was just for some reason never patched out. I guess it was like left there from back when they were putting the level together, and it's just now floating in the sky. And then there was one point where I actually saw like a seam in the sky where you could see the clouds weren't matching up quite right. But these are small P's. Bloodborne is a visual orgasm. It is a joy to look at from the very first moment you turn the game on to the very last moment when you turn it off. It will never look bad. If you like, gothic churches and castles and all that other shit, you will love this game. The gameplay, I talked before about the aggressiveness factor, but there's more to it than that I think is interesting to talk about. There's a big departure from Dark Souls, whereas Dark Souls, there were a ton of weapons in Dark Souls. You would pick up weapons from enemies, sometimes they were random, you'd find them in chests, and that made it so that your inventory was clogged up with all of these superfluous weapons. In Bloodborne, there aren't as many weapons, but they're all one of a kind and crazy unique. Like in Dark Souls, you've got 10 variations on the sword, the Drake sword, the straight sword, the claymore, the great sword. In Bloodborne, all of the weapons are they're called trick weapons because they all have a tricked mode where they do different crazy things. The simple ones, one of them you start out with is the saw cleaver, the iconic one on the cover of the game. It's this handheld saw that when the hunter flicks it, opens up to use the sharp side rather than the serrated side of the blade, and you get more reach on it. But you can also get the threaded cane, which is a cane that you flog people with, but then when you activate the trick mode, it becomes a serrated whip. You can get the Kirk hammer, which is a giant fucking hammer that you can smash people with. But then if you hit a button, you can pull a sword out of it. You can get the stake driver, which is like this sharp thing that you bludgeon people with. But then when you hold down the charge button, you can actually, as the name implies, drive a huge stake into your enemies with an explosion, and it's fucking badass. What else? You can get the arm of one of the bosses and just swing the arm around like it's a weapon. There's all sorts of crazy weapons. You can get swords that shoot energy beams. You can get something called the whirligig saw, which is this huge circle saw blade on the end of a stick, and you can hold down a button and the weapon spins, and you can circle saw your way through like a fucking pizza cutter. It's great. But yeah, the Bloodborne went for quality over quantity, and it absolutely pays off. And the other cool thing is I mentioned that there's no shields in the game because you have a gun. Bloodborne does away with the shields. You just have a gun, and you use the gun to parry. If you shoot your enemy in the middle of an attack animation, for the most part, you can stagger them and get a special visceral attack in, which does a ton of damage and can even grant you some other effects depending on some other choices you make in the game. Another cool thing about Bloodborne that I really like is that the armor isn't such a big deal. The encumbrances from Dark Souls are gone. You no longer have to worry about fat rolling. But then at the same time, in Bloodborne, your armor doesn't really mean a whole lot. They call it fashion-born because, the big thing about your armor set is really just the aesthetics you want. There are some resistances that can be helpful. Like if you're really, really struggling on a boss, you can try to equip the armor that gives you the best resistance against that boss and, get a little bit of an edge, but it's never going to be you're only taking half the damage now because you've equipped the right armor. It's like a slight boost. Because Bloodborne really wants you to prioritize your skills at playing the game rather than simply having the best gear equipped. So you don't have to worry about fetching the right set of armor from some corner of the map. You'll be fine with what you have. You just have to play better. That's sort of the underlying philosophy of all of Bloodborne. You can easily beat Bloodborne with the very first weapon you get in the game and nothing else. You just have to get good. I'm sitting here fucking rambling about a 4-year-old game. Everyone already knows about Bloodborne. So, this is kind of a useless rant for most people, but I will say that if you haven't played Bloodborne, give it a try. Even if you haven't liked other From Software games, Bloodborne is oftentimes, from my experience and talking to people, the game that gets you into From Software games. I've heard a lot of people say that they hated Dark Souls and they wouldn't play one, but then they played Bloodborne and fell in love with that. And that could be you. So if you haven't tried Bloodborne after all this time, give it a shot and have some patience with it. I quit for over a year. When I got frustrated with the game, it took me over a year to get back to it, and now I love it. And that could be you, so just try it. It's awesome.